Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, the Answer Company. The Division Championship Minnesota Twins are looking to go all the way to the World Series in 2024. Bolstered by inspirational shortstop Carlos Correa, a healthy Brian Buxton, and rookie phenom Royce Lewis, plus a pitching staff led by Pablo Lopez and an outstanding bullpen featuring Johan Duran, the Twins are the best bargain in the major leagues, and Target Field is the best venue in baseball. Sheridan Dulas & Kins, PA, a family and criminal defense law firm, has been serving clients in Dakota County and throughout Minnesota for over 40 years. Ranked a Tier 1 Best Law Firm by U.S. News and World Report every year since 2009, Sheridan Dulas & Kins are here to help you in your most difficult life circumstances. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to welcome back to our program a previous guest who's been with us at least once before, Professor Richard Logan. And we're going to have a very interesting discussion today about the topic of his experiences in traveling and teaching and learning in Africa, particularly in Kenya, Tanzania, the southern portion of Africa. Richard, welcome back to Access to Democracy.
Thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure. And boy, congratulations to you and Sharon and Alan for everything you've done through Access.
It's a privilege to do it. Yeah. And so for those viewers who may not have seen your previous interview, just give us a quick synopsis. Where were you born and raised? Where did you go to school? What did you study?
I was born in a very, very small town in upstate New York. And I grew up in a series of small towns around upstate New York. And then at the age of 10, we moved to Vermont. Mm-hmm. My father was a Methodist preacher, and he got sent around to different places every 2 to 3 years. So I went to 5 schools while I was growing up, all public high schools. I was really, really fortunate, coming from a small town, to be accepted to go to Harvard. And I think the only reason I got accepted was I'd won some writing awards. I wasn't really so bright in a lot of other areas. But then I majored in anthropology. Sophomore year, I chose anthropology as my major because I was really fascinated by other cultures. My parents had exposed me to, they tried to instill a wider view of the world, even though my father was a Methodist preacher. But he was very liberal intellectually. After my sophomore year, and I was a brand new anthro major. God knows how this worked out, but I got a grant to go spend 10 weeks by myself in a fishing village in the island of Martinique in the Caribbean. And there I became really fascinated by the influence of African cultures throughout the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. Of course, we know that that's true of our country. It's true of Latin America.
South America,
Brazil has the largest population of African descent outside of Africa,
right?
Because of the slave trade. So,
just to round out your education real quickly before we forget, you graduated also from Harvard and the University of Chicago.
I got my doctorate at the University of Chicago in interdisciplinary human development. I had an anthro major and a psych minor as an undergraduate. And so the human development is the interdisciplinary study of the life cycle. But my major professor was an Africanist, and through his connections, he helped me succeed in getting a teaching position at the University of Nairobi as a wet behind the ears, brand new.
What year was this, Richard?
This was 1970. Yeah. I'm a little older than I look.
And so you go to Africa
Yeah.
in the early 1970s on this academic mission there, and you're in Kenya. And so tell us about a few of the most remarkable experiences you had during your initial time in Kenya.
Well, one of the most remarkable was kind of a trial by fire. My first class was a social psychology class, and that hadn't been something I had to really work hard to prepare for that. And I walk in, and there's a sea of dark faces there. And anyway, long story short, a lot of them were African American students from the University of California coming to Africa for that kind of cultural experience for themselves. And they weren't too pleased to see a young white American guy, but anyway, teaching the class. But anyway, it worked out just fine in the end. And there was that. We had a host of wonderful experiences. It would take many, many hours to go through all the wonderful experiences. My wife Carol worked on the research project that I was associated with.
That's how you met?
Well, no, we were already married. We had met at the University of Chicago in graduate school. She was in Slavic studies and I was in human development. That's how we met. But she ended up doing some important research along with the project while I was teaching at the University of Nairobi.
And so you've described yourself to me previously as a cultural anthropologist. Say a little bit more about what that means.
Well, culture, any organized group of people has a shared way of doing things, their language, their rituals, their ceremonies, their beliefs, their values, and so on. And a cultural anthropologist studies those patterns. And, I will treasure forever the things I learned from the cultures of village Africa in East Africa, particularly Kenya. It was mostly the Kikuyu people, who are the largest tribe in Kenya. They are an agricultural people. And the Masai people, who are pastoral, nomadic cattle herding with a long established warrior tradition, which doesn't mean they're particularly violent, by the way, which is an interesting side note to the whole thing.
It's interesting to me that you are in Africa some 50 years ago at a time that is within about a decade or so of the independence of a number of the countries that used to be colonies, including Kenya, that was a former British colony, but had achieved its independence, I think, in the mid-1960s, Jomo Kenyatta, and some of the political leadership down there. So you were down there as these are newly independent countries, and their societies have changed quite a bit from colonial times.
Right. It's interesting. Kenya was granted its internal independence in 1963, and then it was granted its external independence in 1964, which meant that they took charge of their foreign relationships and military and things like that. Interesting that Jomo Kenyatta, the first president, the father of the nation, Baba wa Taifa in Swahili, father of the country, he was an anthropologist himself.
I didn't know that.
That Jomo Kenyatta had studied. He wrote a best-selling book called Facing Mount Kenya, which is an interesting ethnography of some of the rituals and ceremonies and so on.
By the way, Richard, how big is Kenya? What's the population of the country approximately?
Oh, gosh. Right around today, it might be around 30 million, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not really up to date on that number, but it has dozens of tribes and dozens of languages. It's interesting compared to how so many Americans only speak one language. A lot of Kenyans, even if they're not particularly exposed to the kinds of opportunities we are, they'll speak 3 languages. They'll speak their tribal language, they'll speak the lingua franca of Kenya and East Africa, Swahili, and they'll speak English.
And speaking of languages, did you learn Swahili while you were there, or learn
Kidogo
some
sana.
Swahili?
I learned a little bit.
Yeah.
My wife Carol is much more of a linguist than I am. She was better at Swahili than I ever was. I learned how to greet people in Kikuyu, how to greet people in Masai, how to greet people in Swahili.
So while you were down there, you were doing teaching assignments in Nairobi, but you also were getting out into what you call village Africa.
That's
Say
right.
a little bit about the differences between Nairobi and then going out to these villages that are perhaps some distance from the capital of Kenya.
Well, Nairobi was probably, it's, like you said, it's not that many years after independence, but it had been a lot of exposure to British and European influences because of the colonial history. And Nairobi was really kind of the unofficial capital of all of East Africa when it came to commerce and everything. So Nairobi was comparatively cosmopolitan, but if you go out into the countryside, into the villages, you'll see things that in many fundamental ways are the same as they were centuries ago in terms of the rituals and ceremonies and so on, yes.
You had an opportunity, you've told me, that you had met a Masai elder who made quite an impression on you. Tell that story, if you would.
Yes.
Share that story with
and
our viewers.
there's an extraordinary, I'm sure a lot of people can relate.
And we have a photograph of
Yes.
him, which will be worked into the program here. Hopefully our viewers can see that. Very distinguished looking man.
Right, and he was to the Masai what Jomo Kenyatta was to the Kikuyu in terms of being a leader in the struggle for independence. I like to think of him as the Masai's Nelson Mandela. He was a brilliant young man. He was in Parliament at a very young age, and there's an extraordinary coincidental, maybe the most extraordinary coincidence of my whole life, with a Minnesota connection. So maybe if we could call up that picture. And I do have some artifacts that I would share. Let's see. I don't see the picture.
No, it'll be put in post-production.
Okay. Well, I got to Kenya, and I had a student at UW Green Bay who might have been the only Masai student in all of Wisconsin, including Madison. And he and I became friends, and when I got to, he said, when you get to Nairobi, you've got to meet my family. And his father had recently retired. He was an elder by now, a Maasai elder, very distinguished man. He had retired from Parliament after many years. And it turns out that in the 1960s, when this man, John Ole Conchella, when this man was quite young himself, but recently had come back from educated at a university in Britain, Charles Lindbergh from Minnesota went to Kenya many times in the 1960s. And just as an extraordinary coincidence, this same man had met Charles Lindbergh, and they worked together. And this particular Maasai leader was very influential in transforming Lindbergh into an environmentalist in the last decade of his life. Personally, I think Lindbergh was doing penance for other things he did earlier on, I think, as many Minnesotans.
You're talking about his views during the 1930s.
America First, the Nazi connection, and some of those things. So yeah.
Had what many people saw as anti-Semitic views.
Right. I got to know Lindbergh's children. None of them embraced the views of their father. He had many children.
But so he becomes, after this experience in Africa, he becomes an environmentalist.
Absolutely, a very active environmentalist. And so, anyway, that's an interesting. But if I could, one of the most rewarding experiences of my life was that I raised money, some thousands of dollars. I raised money to help build a primary school building in southwestern Kenya in part of the Masai homeland. And they made me an honorary elder of the Masai, which is, I had to defeat a senior warrior in order to qualify to be an elder. I'm sure they let me tap him on the head. But yes, and so I tapped him on the head with this. This is called a rungu in the Maasai language. And it's actually a weapon. It's a club, but it's also can be used as a throwing stick. But as in many instances in indigenous cultures around the world over time that have a warrior tradition, they have ceremonialized all of that. So this is a ceremonial version of a rungu. And this is what a leader would carry. It's not a weapon at all. But if you look at, say, the Maori in New Zealand and many other peoples around the world, their warrior tradition carries on in a ceremonial way, not in a war-fighting way. And this is one example of that, the symbolic significance of this. It resembles the weapon, but it's really a symbol.
More ceremonial.
Ceremonial and a symbol of authority and so on.
Right,
yeah.
right.
So I treasure the time I spent with the Maasai people.
That's quite an honor that you have.
Oh, it's one of the, it's way, way up there. It's one of the greatest honors of my life. And I've got some pictures of myself in Maasai robes and so on, but yeah.
You brought some other items here too? You want to
Well,
tell
this
our
is,
viewers
a lot
about
of people have heard of, the Maasai. Historically, their main diet was milk and blood. They were a cattle herding people, and one of the reasons they had a warrior tradition was because they had movable wealth, and so they needed to protect their cattle. And so that's true of many of the great warrior cultures of Africa were pastoral herding people, like the Tutsi in Rwanda and various others, or the Zulu in South Africa. This is a gourd, and it still smells of ashes because milk would be mixed with blood. And if you smell that, you can smell the ashes that they would use, the burned ashes, even after 50 years.
Oh my goodness.
That's how pungent that is. So yes.
Yeah, show the front of that too. It has some.
Oh yes, these are cowrie beads.
Yeah.
And cowrie shells rather, and cowrie shells are used all across the continent of Africa. They're traded from the coast to the interior.
So are they like a type of currency?
Yeah, they do have that use in certain settings, yes.
Yeah.
And so, yes. And then I have some other artifacts that are not Masai. I love to show this one. And I contemplate, sometimes when my wife thinks I'm sitting there doing nothing, I'm actually staring at this and contemplating this, because I'm pretty sure that most people would look at this and think Pablo Picasso. And I love to show this because it really underlines the point that, yes, you can find a connection between African sculpture and art and the works of Picasso. But believe me, these people were not imitating Picasso. It was completely the other way around. And I think that just
But what we're looking at here, this is considered a mask?
No, this is
just an object of art?
This is an object of art.
Okay.
There's a tradition of masks as well. But this, to me, it does, if you've seen the Picasso sculpture on the City Hall
Chicago
Plaza in Chicago, it's a bit like that, eyes up here. And so it's very, very stylized, very abstract. But I love to sit there and contemplate it.
And the type of wood in this?
This would ordinarily be ebony.
Ebony.
You can find
hand carved.
Hand carved, yes. And you can find imitations of this which aren't ebony but are blackened with shoe polish. But yeah, so yeah.
And a couple of other
and
items.
this other one over here is similarly stylized thing with some human attributes, but it's in a very Picasso-esque kind of a way. But again, Picasso imitated the Africans more than the other way around. And this, bless her heart, this is an elder's cane that I didn't come by in Africa. My wife found it here in Minneapolis and bought it for me. It's a kind of a ceremonial, a ceremonial thing that an elder would used more in symbolic ways than as an actual walking cane. But it does work as a walking cane.
Very beautiful piece.
Yeah.
Intricately carved.
So, but in terms of one of the most profound experiences, another one of the most profound experiences I had there was when I was in a village outside of Nairobi in the Kikuyu area, the traditional agricultural people, talking with a Kikuyu elder, and he talked with me for an afternoon, and what he had to say would easily qualify for a doctoral dissertation at a university in the United States, because he proceeded to tell me all of the reasons why in traditional Kikuyu Africa, village Africa, there would never be, ever, any such thing as a forgotten elder or an abandoned child. And what he did in extraordinary detail was to spell out the responsibilities of all the people of different degrees of kinship relationship to, say, a family where a mother might have died, and so there was a baby there, or a family who, say, if an elder person had lost his family for whatever kind of disease reason or something. So,
what you're describing there, am I understanding this correctly, Richard, that it's really a sense of community and responsibility beyond your blood family,
Right.
beyond your blood relatives? It's an expanded notion of
Right.
who is in the family.
it goes from the family to the furthest extent of the set of familial relationships, to the clan, to the lineage, to the tribe. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because another really striking experience when I got there, I was brought to the University of Nairobi to teach social sciences, sociology, anthropology, mostly sociology and anthropology, and there were other classes in political science and economics. And one of the things that was really striking was the students there were very interested in all of these large-scale social sciences. But guess what they were not interested in? Psychology. Because the organic unit that is so central to people's lives there is not the individual person. It is the larger entity to which that everybody belongs. So when you say, when you mention community, community is an organic reality. And you can say this across all of the villages of sub-Saharan Africa.
And by the way, I would just make an observation too from
Please,
reading I've done.
Yeah.
I don't think that's unique to Africa.
Oh,
that
no.
You see that in other indigenous cultures around the world.
Absolutely.
The Maori in New Zealand, the native people of Australia, the Aboriginal people there, in some of the island nations of the Pacific,
Oh, yes. And
South America, indigenous communities. It's a
among
very different notion
among
of society.
indigenous Americans too. I mean,
Right.
One of the features of Western culture is individualism, and you can trace the roots of that. Actually, I did some studying of this when we were on sabbatical in Canterbury, England. You can trace the roots of it to what they call the High Middle Ages in the West, but that's a subject for a different conversation.
Interview.
But
So I want to ask you,
yeah.
Richard, we're getting down on time here,
Oh my
about
gosh.
5 minutes left.
So fast?
Yeah, it always happens that way. But I want to ask you, you have said to me as we've talked about your experiences in Africa, that you think there are some lessons that Americans could learn from tribal or village Africa. Could you elaborate on that? What are some of the lessons you think that would serve us well to take note of?
Well,
beyond what we've already talked about.
If I had a specialty in cultural anthropology, I would talk about, I'd say, rituals and ceremonies. And one of the things that I don't think we do well enough is honor the transition from childhood through adolescence into adulthood, what they call rites of passage. Ceremonies in village Africa are very, very compelling. And ceremonies really carry on or communicate the knowledge of the elders. And one of the things that's interesting, and one of the things I would say when I was teaching anthropology to my students is that society changes in some profound ways when kids do not have significant connections to their grandparents. And in that connection, it's very interesting that, say, when it comes to the major ceremonies and rituals that are used to school young people about the traditions and so on and the values of a particular tribe or community, those things are managed not by the parents' generation, but by the elders' generation. The other thing is, I would say to the people of Minnesota and the United States generally, that just because some older people have left their country, they've left Vietnam or Africa or South America or wherever they come from, doesn't mean they left their wisdom behind. And one of the forms of wisdom that elders in many, many traditional societies carry is how to manage human relationships. Mm-hmm. And I think, hey, if you look around, I think we could use a little bit of help when it comes to that.
It seems that modern American society, or I'd even expand it beyond that, Western society
Absolutely.
In general,
Yeah.
that there's this emphasis on the youth culture and sort of degrading or downplaying, as you say, the knowledge, the experience of the elders. And, you know, it's different when you have communities where you have people of different generations living in the same household.
Yes.
But we tend not to have that so much here. There was a time in America when that was true, but in modern American society, modern Western society, it seems that's not really true anymore. And we lose something because of that. I think that's what you would suggest too.
Right. One of the things that happened with industrialization and so on is the rise of the nuclear family, because an industrial society required a workforce to be mobile.
Right.
And it's easier to move mom and dad and a kid or two than it is to move an entire extended family. And so the nuclear family is a feature. I mean, however a society is organized, I would say it does some things well, but it pays a price by not doing other things so well. And so it's an interesting kind of a balance.
There have been a lot of stories in the news over recent years about dislocation due to climate change, drought, famine, political unrest, military unrest, particularly in Eastern Africa, maybe further up in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Somalia,
Sudan,
but also in Southern Africa too,
yes.
More recently in Tanzania and Kenya. What do you see, we're down to about a minute and a half, what do you see as the future for Africa?
I think Africa has immense potential if the people of Africa can get control over their own resources. Mm-hmm. In the real world, the control of Africa's resources is not in the hands of Africans. It's the hand of international
multinationals from other parts of the world, Europe and the U.S.
Or say the government of China at this point, and some things like that. But I think, you know, the world is full of dislocated people, but African elders, I think, can remind people everywhere what it means not to be dislocated, to know who you are by knowing where you came from and so on.
Very valuable benefits that come from that experience.
Right.
Yeah. Professor Richard Logan, thank you for coming on Access to Democracy today and sharing your very interesting experiences during your time teaching and learning, yourself learning in Africa. And thank you for bringing Show and Tell today, some very interesting objects of art to our viewers. Thank you for watching this edition of Access to Democracy, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.